Hi, welcome along. Thanks for joining in. It's a new experience to do this live, but hopefully it'll save a few of you a bit of a trip into town to catch up and ask your questions about feeding cattle. I've had a couple of really interesting questions beforehand, but before I start to answer those questions, if you do have something you would like to ask, feel free to type your comments into the button underneath the video screen and I'll answer them as they come up. Otherwise, you can send me a direct message if you want to be private in what you're saying. Either way, ask your questions. Make sure you ask them so that I can actually help you answer anything that you'd like and get that dealt with straight away. The first question that I've actually had come in is from Guy down in the Upper Hunter, who was asking me a lot about cottonseed. So cottonseed is a terrific feed to provide to animals. It's got a very high level of energy. It has a very high level of crude protein. And so what we actually find that we can do with that is use it in both a drought feeding circumstance when you don't have a lot of pasture feed, but also in the early phases where it's just a lot of dry standing feed. So cottonseed is a terrific feed in that way. The challenge with cottonseed is to make sure that you feed it to the right class of stock. One of the questions that Guy had was about feeding it to bulls. And we know that cottonseed actually has a pigment in it which is known as gossypol. So gossypol does have an impact on animal fertility, on bull fertility. So our recommendations are not to feed cottonseed to bulls in the 2 to 3 months prior to joining, and that if you were looking to feed young bulls, don't feed it to young bulls at all. Some of the work that's been done, particularly overseas, says that cottonseed has an effect on testicular development in younger cattle, and so for young bulls, or for young rams for that matter, it would be something we'd avoid feeding. For older cattle, in that lead up to joining, particularly if you are thinking about that joining time now, don't feed it to cattle in that lead up process. While joining's happening, we know the bulls will probably get a bit of a feed of cottonseed with the cows. That's okay. It's not an instant effect that gossypol will have, so it's unlikely to be a big suppressant during joining, but certainly I wouldn't be feeding it in that lead up to joining to 2 to 3 months. The other thing with cottonseed, before I guess we move on to a couple of the next questions, cottonseed is as I say, a very, very useful feed and is very rumen friendly. But that gossypol that lives in there needs a functioning rumen to break it down. So that would mean avoiding feeding it to young animals, so anything that doesn't have a functioning rumen, so young calves, anything under about 150 kilos in live weight doesn't have a functioning rumen, so it can't break that gossypol down. So I wouldn't be recommending in any way using it for young cattle or for young lambs, and certainly avoid feeding it to horses and pigs and chooks because they don't have a functioning rumen either. With those older cattle, when you feed cottonseed, again, a very versatile feed, difficult to handle because you actually have to shovel it out rather than being able to auger it or put it into self-feeders. The fuzziness stops it flowing. What I suggest to most people is to actually just shovel it out into lumps on the ground, about 20 kilos or so, which is enough for about 4 or 5 cows to get around to feed. You only need to feed it 3 times a week. You don't necessarily have to feed it every day. The other part, remember, cottonseed, like any grain, is pretty high in phosphorus and low in calcium. So it's important to think about adding calcium in the form of limestone to your cottonseed, and it's about 1% by weight of the cottonseed. Again, the practicalities of actually doing it, lots of people have tried different things. The best way that I find is to load the cottonseed onto the back of a ute and know that if you put 500 kilos on the back of a ute, which is really not a lot because it is so easy to move around in a bucket situation, put your limestone over the top. By the time you've driven out to the paddock, the limestone will have bounced its way through and mixed its way into the cottonseed. So a pretty important way of doing it. Very, very good in paddock circumstances. Cottonseed is a self-limiting feed. So there's a fair bit of oil content in cottonseed, which means that cattle tend to limit their intake to about 2.5 to 3 kilos, more than about 2.5 kilos for cows. For young stock, dry stock, you'd probably only be feeding about 1 kilo or so. So I hope that that helps you out with that one, Guy. So just a quick question then for Emma. Herbert, thanks Emma. When you're thinking about early weaning, what's more critical? Is it the age of the calf or the weight of the calf? I think that probably it's come back a little bit. There are two things. One is the condition of your cow, and secondly, the age and is more a bit of a guider. We probably wouldn't wean under about 4 weeks of age unless you were really forced to do that. Normally we would be aging, early weaning from about 4 weeks onwards. You could do that. So we know that there's plenty of people who've taken early wean calves from 4 to 12 weeks and 12 to 16 weeks. If you are going to early wean, I guess what I'd be thinking about is getting those calves over that month of age, but then divide your cattle up into a couple of groups. So not all of those calves are going to be the same weight. There's going to be that little bit of a range there, Em. So I'd be trying to put them into a couple of groups, big ones in one group and little ones in a second group. Make sure that when you do early wean that you're able to keep them in those groups to avoid that overfeeding of bullying animals that will dominate the little ones out of the way. Start them off with a bit of a roughage type ration first. You can use the calf premixed pellets that are quite useful. Again, the important thing to think about is make sure you have enough trough space for your calves. So a lot of people skimp on their trough sizes, and what happens then is those bigger, more dominant calves will push the little ones out of the way. They'll gorge on the pellets, they'll get sick, then the little ones either miss out and they don't get anything, or when they eventually get a feed, they're either getting a limited amount or they're trying to catch up and they'll get sick by scoffing it down. So having adequate trough space, for little calves, it's about 45 centimetres per head, so it's a chance for them to get in there and actually eat the pellets and have enough room to do that. You will need to have some roughage on hand, so a good quality roughage, and make sure that that's sort of up in troughs or hay racks so that you don't get a lot of waste. It's important to do that. Start with the roughage first and then introduce the pellets as you go. So hopefully that answers that question for you, Emma. The other question that came in a little bit earlier was about the transition now from feeding dry feeds and protein mixes into drought feeding and energy feeding. So in that circumstance, and this was from out near the other side of Gunnedah, we really need to be driven by the amount of pasture feed that we actually have on hand. So when with cattle you get below about 1,200 kilos of dry matter, you really need to be thinking that protein supplementation is not going to be the most efficient way to use your money or to feed your livestock. Protein supplementation is really about feeding the rumen to utilise dry standing feed. And for most people, we're now transitioning away from that into full hand feeding. Full hand feeding is really based around providing energy in the cheapest and most convenient way to do that. And I would suggest that to do that, what you really need to be thinking about is transitioning into concentrated forms of energy. And in most cases for livestock, both sheep and cattle, that's going to be grain. The choices that you'd be thinking about looking will really come back down to the most convenient and cheapest form to get that grain delivered on farm. And you will need to think about how you introduce grain into a diet. You can't just launch straight into feeding grain. You have to develop some rumen tolerance to be able to do that. So we would start by introducing a small amount of grain. Again, you would be feeding it. Sheep you can get away with feeding on the ground, but for cattle, you really need to be feeding in troughs. But we would start off by feeding roughage, and we would generally use a fairly high amount of roughage to start with over the first couple of days. And then we would start to reduce the amount of roughage and increase the amount of grain until you get to your desired ration level. It's important that you always have roughage on hand. Rumens need to have some roughage within the rumen to allow digestion to happen and to keep the contents of the rumen at the right pH level. So roughage is a really important component of a diet, and you do need to provide roughage. About 20% is where you would get to if you're onto a full hand feeding program. Okay, so don't forget, if you're just tuned in, and there's quite a few people just tuning in, my name's Alistair Rayner and I'm the principal of Rayner Ag. We're based here in Tamworth, and one of my jobs is to work closely with producers. I see there's a few clients have tuned in, so thank you for doing that. The last few weeks we've been out looking at a number of different operations. A lot of beef breeding programs at the moment have got a couple of challenges in front of them. So traditionally this time of the year, particularly with our spring weaning cattle, we'd be thinking about weaning. Hopefully most people have already made some decisions about your cow herd. As Emma Herbert asked a little bit earlier on about early weaning, it's not something that people do every year. But weaning a cow is an important part of your drought strategy. And taking that extra energy level off your cow is a really important thing for a couple of ways. Firstly, it allows the calf the chance to grow normally. And we know that if you hold your calves back at a younger age, they never really catch up. And so those cattle tend to be much smaller, and when they get to their final finish weights, will be fatter and have less yield than their normally grown siblings. So from a production point of view, you really want to keep your calves growing. From my perspective, and more importantly, you need to keep your cows in good order so that you can rejoin successfully. We want to be able to come out of this drought having cattle that are fertile and able to keep your production levels happening to the standard that you expect. Calves take about 50% more energy to feed than than a dry cow requires. So it's a huge lift in energy, and as those calves get bigger, you can really see the weight come off your cows. That weight and that body condition is really important in keeping your cows able to cycle when joining time comes around. And so what we want to do by taking those calves off is give your cows a chance to recover some of their condition or maintain some of their condition, so that when you look for joining in a few months' time, you can actually be confident that your cows are in a good enough order to start to join. What we would really encourage, and what I've been doing with my producers, has been to go through the cow herd and be very objective about what you're doing. It's important to go through and firstly preg test your cows. Now, pregnancy testing is just that most objective way of being able to tell exactly what cows are productive in your herd. Take away those ones that are non-productive. Those cows that are not going to produce a calf this year and not going to calve down really don't belong in your herd, particularly when feed is limited. So take them out of the herd as a priority group to take out. The second thing to do during pre-testing is to go through and identify, I guess, the next group of cattle to take away. I talk about a targeted hit list. For me, that's the group of cows that have got some question marks around them. So again, cows that have gone into calf late, so those ones that are less fertile, so they continually are late in the cycle. Take those out. That's a selection for fertility in the longer term, which will benefit your program anyhow. And secondly, by selecting for fertility, you will have a better program down the track. So that's a group that can go. I tend to also look for cows that are older and take out those older ones, and talk about taking out ones with structure or temperament. So Alice Noble's just asked a question about protein, and is protein important in early weaning? Absolutely. When you're choosing your protein options or your feeding options for young calves, remember you're trying to keep your young calves growing. So Alice, what we would really look to do in a ration for early wean calves is to base it around a high level of crude protein. Normally we would be saying at least 16% crude protein as a minimum. 16 to 18% tends to be where most of the manufactured calf pellets come from. If you were making your own rations up, so if you were looking to manufacture your own early wean rations, which you can do with a couple of different recipes, which if you'd like, I'm happy to send to you after this recording. But when you go in to order your pellets, make sure you're ordering calf pellets that have got that 16% crude protein as a minimum. Anything less than that, you're not going to be able to get that that skeletal development and that muscle development that's really important. So in calves and calf rations, that's one of those high important things to consider. Different for older cows where it's really about energy with a little bit of protein. Young calves have got to be very targeted. Don't forget, I guess, with this is really, asking the questions that you would like to have. If you'd like some really specific questions, send me a message certainly afterwards and we can follow up anything that you have done. One of the questions people have asked is, do I come out and actually sit down and talk through specific strategies? And yes, I do. So if you'd like me to talk to you about how we can do that, please send me a message after this session and we can work something out. I'll give you a call this afternoon and we can have a quick chat about where we go from there. The other topic that was sent to me also out of the Hunter, where the guys seem to be doing it a little bit tougher down there, is some of the different feeds that are coming onto the market, some unusual feeds. So one of those is a product that for some people is a bit more unheard of, but again, close to the Hunter. They have a product which is known as Grape Mark. Now, Grape Mark, if you haven't heard of it, is the residual amount of grapes, the crushed wine stems and the old grapes that have been used after the wine making process. Generally very high in energy, a bit lacking in protein, so you need to balance that out a little bit. But the other thing to remember with Grape Mark is generally it's a very high moisture content feed. So moisture has a couple of things. First of all, it can lead to, I guess, a few risks associated with molds and fungus growing on Grape Mark, particularly if you store it for a few weeks or something like that before you feed it out. Unfortunately, I've worked with a couple of producers now who've been caught with Grape Mark that they haven't fed straight away. It's started to grow a mold and started to get a bit of a funky colour about it. And the molds and the fungus can actually become toxic to stock, particularly if they eat too much of it. So it's one of those feeds you need to think a little bit more about how would you use it and where does it fit into your system of things. The other part of comparing feeds is you really need to take that moisture content out. If you're bringing moisture in a truck that's part of a feed, and if the feed that you've loaded on, if the truck was 100 kilos of weight for every 100 kilos, and it was 30% moisture, that's 30 kilos of water you're trucking up and down the highway that doesn't actually add nutritional value. Compare that to maybe a grain that could be 90% dry matter, much less moisture to be tracking up to your farm. But secondly, when you feed that in the ration, it means the amount of feed that you're providing for the animals is quite different. So you need to actually balance up how you would feed your rations and what you're feeding them to. If you are buying an unusual feed, particularly some of those different feeds from like Grape Marks or other products that you haven't come across before, it is really important that you look for your commodity vendor declarations to make sure you have a record of what you fed. You don't want to have be caught in the position where you haven't been able to guarantee what you fed, and you have a requirement with the LPA on your vendor declarations to complete the stock feed and what animals have been fed in the last 60 days. So making sure that you ask for those commodity vendor declarations for all the feeds you're providing, but particularly for those unusual feeds is going to be a really important point of backup. So thank you for that question. I guess I'm having a look in and I see quite a few people tuning in. If you wanted to let me know where you're tuning in from, I know that we've got someone from a couple of people from Tasmania who've got, I guess, very different circumstances to Megan Rogers, who's watching us in the Central West. And the Central West is in that position now where we're starting to change around, again coming into winter time and thinking a little bit about the transition from dry feed to hopefully some of those cropping options that might be coming into play, particularly people who've taken a bit of a gamble with some sowing. If you have that, I guess, that risk of some grazing crops coming through that you want to actually use short green feed, can always be a bit of a challenge. Remember that when you transition any of your feed across, to think in the back of your mind about the change in feed that your animals might be doing. So if you're going from dry, very ordinary paddock feed into young grazing crops or even onto a grain ration, if that was what you were doing, the change in the way that those animals' diet has will impact their immunity to diseases like pulpy kidney. So again, I'd be really encouraging you before you start feeding to think about booster shots, a 5-in-1 booster, particularly for your young growing stock, and probably for those cows that you're looking to feed high levels of grain, or if you're putting cattle onto a grazing program, a 5-in-1 would be a really useful program to actually think about doing to make sure that you're protected against pulpy kidney as you change that flow of feed through the digestive system. So we'll shortly be coming to the end of this session. Today's really just a first half hour to answer a few more burning questions. The only other couple of questions that have come through that really need to be answered comes around the importance when you're purchasing feeds, particularly pellets, but also feeding grains, to remember that there's a little bit of homework you need to do beforehand in terms of, I guess, some preparation as to how long your rations will last for and transitioning between batches. Particularly catches a lot of people out who buy batches of pellets. The early wean question, when we go back a little bit earlier on, when you purchase your product, it will come with a certain amount of crude protein and a certain amount of energy. And that's what we're looking to feed, and that's very important. What you don't necessarily get is a list of the ingredients that make up your pellet. So the manufacturer might be making pellets up with, for example, wheat and other products to get the energy level to the specified level, plus some protein additives to get your crude protein levels right. And that provides you with that pellet and that ration that you've worked along. However, the next ration, while it might also have the same level of energy and protein you're expecting, might have actually been made not with wheat, but the base grain could have been barley or triticale or another grain product. Changing grains, as you know, takes a little bit of time because of the different starch content, so we always transition across in a shandying method. The same thing we'd actually look to try and do is to actually shandy our pellets across so that you actually have don't run out of your pellets and then change onto a new batch tomorrow. Make sure that you work out that your pellets will last you for 10 or 15 days so that you order the next batch well before you run out, so you can shandy one batch across to the other. Similarly, when you are feeding grain, if you're feeding over a period of time, to make sure that you actually transition with that shandying effect across, because otherwise an abrupt change from oats to wheat will really lead to some big digestive upsets. And so we wouldn't want you to actually be responsible for poisoning cattle by changing grains suddenly. You need to have that transition across. The last question that we can really get to here today will come around, and again comes out of the Central West. Thanks very much, Terry, for sending that through to me earlier. The question about cold, wet, windy weather. Look, we are going to see, we've already seen some snowfalls and some cold, wet, windy weather over the past weekend. In those circumstances, hay is probably your best feed, and it's really worth, if you can, putting some hay aside, knowing that we are likely to get at least 2 or 3 cold spells this winter. Hay has got that terrific benefit of being able to give you a very rumen-friendly product, but also the fermentation and the digestion of that hay allows a little bit more body heat to come off and keeps your animals warm and helps them cope a little bit better with that cold, wet, windy period that we often get in the Central West and the Victorian and Tasmanian parts of the country, where those experiences really do knock our animals around. Okay, so we've really only got time for a couple of other questions if any comes in, but if there's not, please feel free to make sure that you stay in touch with Rainer Ag. I do try and post updates fairly regularly about different feeds and feeding strategies. I'm always happy to answer your questions if you send me direct messages, and I'm certainly very happy to make sure that I can come out and give you the advice that you need to have. If you'd like to watch this session again, It will be posted back up on Rainer Ag so that you can watch it at your own time, and feel free to share it with people who you think might benefit from this. If you'd like to have another session where we do ask some Q&As, and if you'd like to have, I guess, a repeat of this program, I'm very happy to do that. Please, again, send me a direct message. But until we do this again, stay confident, stick to your plan. The most important thing that I've done with every person I've visited in the last month has been to set a plan. Really have something structured so that you can work towards a known goal. If you don't, it often gets away from you very quickly. I guess people always say it'll rain tomorrow, it'll rain next week, it'll rain so on. But we need to be a bit objective about what happens until it rains and what happens when the rain comes. So knowing how you'll respond to those circumstances is going to give you a lot of peace of mind. And more than anything else, having that peace of mind and the confidence in a plan that's suitable for your program, suitable for you and for your family to manage, is probably the most important thing to do in any drought, and certainly in this one. And if you want to talk through your plan, get some advice, get some suggestions, please feel free to get in touch. I'm more than happy to give you that advice. There is plenty of opportunity to talk through how things might work for you. And I really appreciate that so many of you have been able to join this discussion this afternoon. And I look forward to hearing from you in the next couple of months. So take care, and thanks again.